The attorney slid the document across the table without looking at me. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "You are not listed as a beneficiary." My mother kept her eyes on her lap. My father stared straight ahead like this was a business transaction. They had cut me out of the will. Completely. And for a moment, I actually believed I deserved it. But what they didn't realize was that buried on page 14, in a clause they had signed without reading carefully, was something that would change everything. If you're here because family silence has cost you something, stay. And if this feels personal, like it echoes something in your own life, consider liking and subscribing, only if it truly connects. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, and sometimes it reminds us we're not as alone as we think. My name is Naomi Adler. I'm 32 years old, and I learned very young that love in my family was conditional. Not cruel, not dramatic, just measured. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Cleveland. Brick house, trim lawn, dinner at 6. My parents valued order, reputation, appearances. My older brother, Ethan, fit that mold perfectly. Straight A's, varsity soccer, business degree. I was different. Creative, emotional. I wanted to study art history. They wanted finance. The first subtle humiliation I remember happened when I was 12. It was career day at school. Parents were invited to speak about their jobs. My father was an accountant with a respected firm. Ethan begged him to come present to his class. I asked too. He chose Ethan. "You understand," he told me gently. "Ethan's more aligned with what I do." Aligned? At 12? I laughed like it didn't matter, but that word stayed with me. By 16, I had learned how to shrink my dreams before they embarrassed anyone. I got good grades, I stayed quiet, I didn't argue when they discouraged art school. I compromised. I majored in marketing instead. "Smart choice," my mother said approvingly. "Practical." Practical meant acceptable. Ethan went into investment banking. My parents bragged about him constantly. I built a career in nonprofit communications. It paid modestly but meaningfully. I was proud of my work. They called it cute. At family gatherings, the conversations always tilted toward Ethan's bonuses, Ethan's condo, Ethan's engagements. I became background. Not excluded, just secondary. When I was 27, I made the first decision that shifted everything. I moved across the country to Seattle. No job lined up, just a freelance contract and a small apartment. My mother cried. "You're abandoning your support system," she said. I almost laughed, but I went anyway. That move saved me. It was the first time I chose something without asking if it aligned. Seattle gave me space to grow into myself. I eventually founded a small consulting firm helping nonprofits with branding strategy. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. Then my father had a health scare. Mild stroke, recoverable, but enough to bring everyone home. I flew back immediately. Ethan arrived 2 days later. My parents made a point of telling everyone how busy he was. "He rearranged critical meetings to be here," my mother said proudly. I had rearranged my entire life to be there. No one mentioned that. That week at the hospital, something subtle shifted again. I handled insurance paperwork. I coordinated doctors. I stayed overnight. Ethan visited between calls. But when relatives came, my father introduced Ethan as the one handling things. I didn't correct him. I never corrected him. 2 months after he recovered, they called a family meeting. Formal, structured, lawyer present. "We've updated our estate plan," my father announced calmly. Ethan sat straighter. I didn't. I assumed fairness. I assumed balance. That assumption was naive. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The primary residence, investment accounts, and business holdings will transfer to Ethan Adler." I waited for my name. It didn't come. Instead, "Naomi has demonstrated independence and chosen a separate path. We believe Ethan will preserve the family legacy." Legacy. There it was again. Aligned. Preserve. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not rage, not yet, just disbelief. "I'm not included at all?" I asked quietly. My mother folded her hands. "We think you'll be fine," she said. "You've always been self-sufficient." Self-sufficient. Another word that sounds like praise but feels like dismissal. "I'm your daughter," I said. "And we love you," my father replied evenly. "But this is about continuity." Continuity of what? Control? Image? Expectation? I nodded slowly. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I left that meeting and sat in my car for 40 minutes staring at the steering wheel. There was a quiet breakdown in that car. No screaming, just tears sliding silently down my face while I realized something painful. They hadn't cut me out because I failed. They cut me out because I didn't conform. And in their version of family, independence disqualified you from inheritance. I flew back to Seattle the next morning. I told myself it didn't matter. Money wasn't my measure of worth. But it wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement, about being seen as equal. 3 weeks later, I received a copy of the finalized will in the mail. Page after page of legal language. My name appeared exactly once, as a witness signature from a previous draft. But when I reached page 14, there was something they clearly hadn't anticipated, and I felt, for the first time since that meeting, not powerless, but curious.
Page 14 wasn't dramatic. No bold font, no highlighted paragraph, just a subsection under something titled Contingency and Moral Provisions. The language was dry, clinical, legal, but I read it 3 times. If the primary beneficiary demonstrates gross negligence in fiduciary responsibility, liquidation of assets, or violation of specified stewardship terms, the estate shall transfer in equal distribution to alternate heir listed in Schedule C. Schedule C. My name was the only one listed under it. I blinked. Slowly. They had cut me out of the main inheritance, but they had included a clause protecting the estate from Ethan, a clause that activated if he mishandled the assets. I sat at my kitchen table in Seattle, rain tapping lightly against the window, and felt something shift. Not victory, not revenge, just understanding. They didn't trust me to carry the legacy, but they didn't fully trust him either. That realization was more complicated than comforting. I didn't tell anyone about the clause. Not my parents, not Ethan. I filed the document in my desk drawer and tried to move forward. But something had changed in me. I stopped calling as often, stopped volunteering updates about my life. When my mother asked about my business growth, I kept it brief. Busy, I'd say. Good. I wasn't punishing them. I was recalibrating. There's a memory that kept resurfacing during that time. I was 9 years old. We were decorating the Christmas tree. My father handed Ethan the star for the top. "He's the eldest," he said. I stood holding an ornament shaped like an angel. I remember thinking, "It's fine, I'll hang mine lower." That's how it had always worked. Ethan reached high, I adjusted. But now, sitting alone in my apartment, holding a legal document that quietly placed me as backup heir, I wondered when I had decided that lower was acceptable. 3 months passed. Then I got a call from my mother. "Have you spoken to your brother recently?" she asked, voice tight. "No." "Well, there's been some concern." Concern, another carefully chosen word. Ethan had started making aggressive investment decisions using family accounts that weren't meant to be touched yet. Nothing illegal, but risky, very risky. "He says he's optimizing growth," my mother said defensively. "Is he?" She hesitated. "We're not sure. There it was again, uncertainty. My father called the next day. "You've always been good with strategic thinking," he said cautiously. "Would you look over something for me?" I almost laughed. 2 months ago, I wasn't aligned enough to inherit. Now I was strategic? He emailed spreadsheets, portfolio breakdowns, asset reallocations. I reviewed them carefully. Ethan wasn't being reckless in a malicious way. He was being ambitious. He saw the estate as leverage, as capital to scale. But the will's stewardship terms were clear: preservation, not speculation. I called my father back. "He's violating the clause," I said simply. Silence. "What clause?" he asked. The air shifted. Page 14. They had signed it, but they hadn't internalized it. "The fiduciary contingency provision," I clarified. More silence. "I didn't think that would ever matter," he muttered. "It matters if he continues." There was a long pause. Then, "Don't mention this to him." "Of course." Silence again. Protect appearances, protect hierarchy. But this time, I wasn't 12 years old holding an ornament lower on the tree. "I won't," I said calmly, "but I won't protect bad decisions either." That was the first boundary I set without emotion, just fact. Weeks passed. Ethan doubled down. More aggressive allocations, more risk exposure. When the market dipped sharply that fall, the impact hit immediately. Not catastrophic, but significant. My father's voice sounded smaller when he called. He said we need to have a conversation. Family meeting, again. I flew home. The same dining table, the same legal folders. But this time, something felt different. Ethan looked defensive before anyone spoke. "I'm growing it," he insisted. "That's what Dad wanted." "I wanted stewardship," my father corrected quietly. He frowned. "That's what this is." "It's not," I said evenly. He turned to me sharply. "Oh, so now you're the expert?" I didn't react. "I'm just reading what's written." The lawyer cleared his throat. "If the terms are violated, the estate transitions to Schedule C." Ethan's face changed. "What's Schedule C?" My father looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't look away.
"What's Schedule C?" Ethan repeated, slower this time. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. He didn't look at me, he looked at my father. Schedule C lists the alternate beneficiary in the event of fiduciary breach. Ethan laughed lightly, dismissive. Alternate? Like a backup? The word landed harder than he meant it to. Backup. That's what I had always been. My father cleared his throat. Naomi is listed as contingent heir. The room went still. Ethan's eyes moved to me, sharp and disbelieving. "Since when?" "Since the last revision," the lawyer answered. "And nobody thought to mention that?" Ethan snapped. I felt something steady inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, just balance. "I didn't know until after the meeting," I said calmly. "It was in the copy you mailed me." Ethan looked at my father. "You put her in as a fallback?" My father hesitated. That hesitation told more truth than words. "It was precautionary," he said finally. Precautionary. Not because they believed in me, because they doubted him. Ethan stood up abruptly. "So I get the responsibility, the expectations, the pressure, and she gets to sit back and inherit if anything goes wrong?" I watched him carefully. He wasn't cruel. He was wounded. "I didn't ask for that clause," I said quietly. "But you benefit from it," he shot back. There was a childhood memory that surfaced in that moment. I was 13. We were building a treehouse in the backyard. Ethan was leading, hammer in hand. I wanted to help. "You'll slow it down," he had said. So I handed him nails instead. That had always been our dynamic. He built, I assisted. Now the structure was wobbling, and suddenly I was standing on steadier ground. "I don't want your failure," I said evenly. "I want transparency." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "You think I'm failing?" "I think you're gambling with something that isn't only yours." My father exhaled slowly. "This isn't about competition." But it had always been, just unspoken. Ethan sat back down. "So what now?" he muttered. The lawyer folded his hands. "If corrective measures are taken and stewardship terms are restored, the clause remains dormant." Dormant. Like a sleeping fault line. My father looked at me. "What would you recommend?" The question stunned me. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because he had asked. "I'd freeze speculative allocations, stabilize the portfolio, create oversight, shared oversight." Ethan stiffened. "You mean you?" "I mean accountability." Silence settled over the table. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about control and recognition. My father nodded slowly. "That's reasonable." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So now she supervises me?" "I didn't say that," I replied. But the truth was clear. For the first time, I wasn't positioned beneath him. That shift unsettled everyone, including me. Later that evening, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom. The walls were still pale blue, the bookshelf still slightly crooked. There was a quiet humiliation memory that returned unexpectedly. I was 15, honor roll ceremony. My name was called before Ethan's for the first time. Afterward, in the parking lot, my father had said, "Don't let it go to your head. You're not competing." But I had been, even if he refused to acknowledge it. I cried quietly that night. Not because I needed praise, but because I wanted fairness. Now, sitting on the edge of that same bed as an adult, I realized something. The will wasn't the wound. The hierarchy was. The clause had exposed something fragile in our family structure. My parents hadn't cut me out because they believed I was incapable. They cut me out because I disrupted their expectations. Ethan had followed the path, I had diverged, and divergence made them uncomfortable. The next morning, Ethan knocked on my door. He didn't sit. He leaned against the frame. "You think you're better than me?" he asked bluntly. "No." "Then why does this feel like a takeover?" "It's not," I said quietly. "It's a safety net." "For you?" "For the family." He looked at me for a long moment. "You've always been patient," he said finally. It wasn't praise, it was realization. "And you've always been trusted." That landed. Neither of us had chosen those roles. They had been assigned. "Maybe we should co-manage it," he said after a while. There it was. Not defeat, adjustment. That conversation wasn't explosive. It was uncomfortable, honest, but something subtle shifted between us. For the first time, we weren't operating from assumed superiority or assumed inferiority. We were negotiating as equals. The clause remained, dormant, but visible, and visibility changes everything.
The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Ethan insisted I attend, not as a silent observer, as co-presenter. That word unsettled me more than I expected. Co-presenter, not assistant, not alternate, not contingency plan. Equal. The morning of the meeting, I stood in my apartment kitchen staring at my reflection in the microwave door. My hands were steady. My stomach wasn't. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about walking into a room where my absence had always been assumed. When I arrived at my parents' house for carpool, my mother studied me for a moment longer than usual. "You look confident," she said. It sounded like a discovery, not an assumption. Ethan was already in the car, laptop bag in the back seat. He didn't make eye contact at first. The drive was quiet, not tense, just recalibrating. At the boardroom, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. I'd been here once before as a teenager, trailing behind my father during a summer internship. I'd carried files. Nobody had asked my opinion. Now I carried my own binder. When the meeting began, Ethan opened with performance summaries. Steady voice, clear charts, no theatrics. Then he glanced at me. "Your turn." I stood. There was a flicker in the room. Recognition, surprise, curiosity. I spoke calmly, proposed reallocations, conservative restructuring, safeguards. Nothing dramatic, just stability. A few board members nodded. One asked a follow-up question. To me, not to Ethan. I answered. No hesitation. And something shifted in the room. Not loud, not obvious, but tangible. After the meeting, one of the senior advisors approached. "Good insight," he said. "Balanced." Balanced. Not aggressive, not ambitious, not disruptive. Balanced. It was the first time in my life someone described my presence that way in a professional setting tied to my family. On the drive home, Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "You were good," he said finally. It wasn't reluctant. It was honest. "I wasn't trying to outperform you," I replied. "I know." A pause. "I think I've been defensive," he admitted. That word mattered. Defensive meant he felt threatened. Threatened meant he saw me as capable. Back at the house, my father called us into his study, the same room where I'd been told I wasn't part of the will. He closed the door. "I've been thinking," he said. That phrase used to make my chest tighten. It meant decisions had already been made. This time it felt different. "I should have discussed the clause openly," he continued, "with both of you." I didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't about apology, it was about acknowledgement. "You assumed I wouldn't handle it well," Ethan said. "I assumed neither of you would," my father corrected. That honesty landed harder than any defensiveness. "You didn't trust either of us," I said quietly. Silence. My mother shifted in her chair. "We trusted you," she said quickly. "But not together," I replied. There it was, the unspoken architecture of our family. Divide, assign roles, avoid overlap. Ethan as heir, me as afterthought. The clause had disrupted that pattern, not by punishing him, but by forcing transparency. My father leaned back. "I never intended for you to feel excluded, Naomi." The name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth without qualification. Not Naomi the sensitive one, not Naomi the different one, just Naomi. "I didn't feel excluded," I said carefully. "I felt managed." That word startled him. Managed? Like a variable, something to account for quietly, not directly. He didn't argue, which told me he understood. That evening, after dinner, my mother knocked softly on my bedroom door. She sat beside me on the edge of the bed. "I thought we were protecting you," she said. "From what?" "Pressure, expectations." I almost laughed. "You gave me no expectations," I said gently. "That's its own pressure." She blinked.
I don't think she'd ever considered that. You were so independent, she murmured. Because I had to be. Not angry, just factual. She reached for my hand. We were wrong. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just quiet admission. That night, I lay awake thinking about the clause again. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. It revealed what had been quietly present for years. Lack of trust, uneven faith, assumptions about strength and fragility. The next morning, Ethan knocked again. "You want to grab coffee?" he asked. We drove to a small cafe near the park, neutral ground. He stirred his coffee for too long. "I always thought you didn't care about this stuff, the business." "I cared. I just stopped fighting for space." He nodded slowly. "I thought Dad trusted me more." "He trusted you differently," that distinction mattered. Different wasn't better. It was just shaped by expectation. "I don't want to lose this," he said suddenly. "Lose what?" "The balance." "Then don't treat it like competition." We didn't hug. We didn't reconcile dramatically. We recalibrated, which felt more real. When I returned home later that day, my father handed me a folder. He said, "I've amended the will." My heart didn't spike this time. Inside were updated documents, shared stewardship language, clear oversight terms, equal beneficiary status, no hidden clause, no contingency, just transparency. He watched my face carefully. "I don't want dormant fail-safes between my children," he said quietly. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't sentimental, but it was progress. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the backup plan. I felt chosen, not instead of Ethan, alongside him.
I didn't feel victorious when I signed the acknowledgement forms. I felt steady. That surprised me. For years, I imagined what it would feel like to be put back in. I thought it would come with fireworks or anger or some dramatic release. It didn't. It felt like exhaling after holding something in my chest for most of my life. The updated will sat on the table between us. Equal beneficiaries, joint oversight, no hidden contingencies, no dormant clauses waiting for someone to fail. Transparent. That word kept echoing. My father adjusted his glasses. "I should have done this sooner," he said. He wasn't looking for absolution. He wasn't performing regret. He was acknowledging delay. "There was a time I would have taken that as an apology," I said quietly. He looked up. "And now?" "Now I just need consistency." That landed differently. Apologies are moments. Consistency is work. Over the next few weeks, something subtle changed in our family rhythm. Board updates came to both of us. Emails were addressed jointly. Conversations included both names. No one made a grand announcement. There was no speech about fairness. It was small corrections, repeated. And repetition builds trust more reliably than dramatic gestures. One evening, my mother invited me over for dinner, just the two of us. She set the table carefully, the way she used to when Ethan had big school achievements. "I didn't realize how much we were shaping you by silence," she admitted over tea. "That's the thing about silence. It still speaks." She reached across the table. "I thought giving Ethan responsibility meant protecting you, and I thought being quiet meant keeping peace." We both sat with that. Two women recognizing inherited patterns. I had a childhood memory that surfaced unexpectedly that night. I was 9. Ethan had broken a vase while running through the living room. My father had scolded him sharply. Later, when I accidentally chipped a plate, my mother had whispered, "Just don't mention it." I learned early that confrontation belonged to him, containment belonged to me.
That division followed us into adulthood, until the clause cracked it open. A month later, Ethan called me unexpectedly. "Want to review next quarter projections together?" he asked. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. We met at a cafe again. There was no edge this time, no territorial tension. We disagreed on one investment, debated it, compromised. Normal sibling friction, not rivalry. And I realized something quietly profound. The clause hadn't saved me, it had exposed imbalance. What we did afterward, that was the real shift. A few weeks later, my father asked if I'd considered joining him at an industry dinner, not as a guest, as his daughter. The invitation was simple, unembellished. I thought about declining, old habits. Instead, I said yes. At the dinner, when introductions circled the table, my father said, "This is my daughter, Naomi. She oversees strategic development with Ethan. No qualifiers, no explanations, no hierarchy, just inclusion." It shouldn't have felt monumental, but it did. Not because of status, because of language. On the drive home, I watched the city lights blur through the window. I didn't feel like I had won. There was no loser in this story, just recalibration. That matters more. A few months later, I sat alone in my apartment, flipping through old journals. One entry caught my eye. I was 16. Maybe if I disappear, it will be easier for everyone. I closed the journal gently. I didn't disappear. I adapted. I grew around the silence. But growth around imbalance leaves scars. The clause forced us to look at those scars. Not dramatically, not destructively, just honestly. And honesty, when it's handled carefully, rebuilds things that pride quietly erodes. There's something I need to say clearly. Being cut out of the will hurt, not because of money, because of what it symbolized: replacement, downgrading, containment. But the clause wasn't revenge, it was an unfinished conversation waiting to be had. And when we finally had it, awkward, uncomfortable, unscripted, something stabilized. Not perfection, not fairy tale unity, just mutual recognition. My relationship with Ethan is still evolving. We don't suddenly share childhood secrets. We don't rewrite the past. But we check in now. We collaborate. We argue without assuming hierarchy. That's growth. My parents still have moments where old habits resurface, subtle preferences, familiar patterns. But now I speak, calmly, directly, without waiting for permission. That's the boundary I set. Not put me back in, not make it equal, just this. Don't manage me quietly. If there's something that affects me, say it, to my face. I don't need contingency plans built around my silence. I need clarity. And clarity doesn't destroy families. Avoidance does. If this story felt personal to you, tell me what boundary you had to set. Sometimes it's not about reclaiming something dramatic. Sometimes it's about refusing to be positioned quietly in the background. I'm not the backup plan. I never was, and I don't need a clause to prove it anymore. Thank you for listening.